We're back, Scott. Fantastic Story Society.
It's good. You know, we're de-thawing as the weather. I mean, for us, gets a little warmer. Sadly, I know LA is having an issue right now. Speaking of
deluge,
yeah,
they call it. Yeah,
but I kind of like that we're on right now because we can have a really fun topic, a conversation about a topic I know you and I both love, storytelling and TV, and we're not going to cut into anybody's primetime TV viewing. We'll be done just in time.
That's right. That's right. Unless you watch Ari on MSNBC far too often, like I tend to do, which I shouldn't admit.
That's not exactly the type of storytelling we'll be talking about today.
It's horrible stories. It's just like, what fresh hell am I going to experience in the news today?
No, yeah, we'll be a little bit more uplifting. But we're going to dive right in because we have such a wonderful guest today. And again, if anybody hasn't checked out one of our Fantastic Story Society podcasts, we Max and I we run this somewhat secret society of the greatest storytellers on the planet. And so each episode we induct a new person that tells an interesting story, contributes to the storytelling world in a variety of different mediums. And so it's fun. I think this is the first time we've really had a kind of a story expert as one of our inductees.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And Jen is definitely one of those. She's been doing this for a long time. She knows TV inside and out. I always feel a little self-conscious when I think about how much more experience Jen has in developing TV than I do, and I'm trying to help writers. But she's awesome. I don't know if I'm going to force her to tell a ghost story because I don't think she has any. But that tends to how we lean sometimes with our podcast, Fantastic Story Society. We're not going to go that route all that much. I have a couple of questions for her that we might pop at her, but we're just generally speaking, which, and I'm assuming most of the people watching this through the International Screenwriters Association or just our podcast, and the fans that we have there, we love story. We like telling stories. We like hearing and consuming stories, and in whatever medium or fashion. And in a way, we might be able to, for those of you who have no inclination to be writing a screenplay anytime soon, you do like telling stories and understanding how stories flow, why you're telling them. It's going to better your chances of engaging people around the bonfire, at the very least.
That's a great way to put it. And let's just begin the induction here. Jen Grisanti started her storytelling journey by being mentored by the legendary Aaron Spelling. So a pretty good start. She works with executive producers, showrunners, and staff of countless primetime shows, giving script notes on shows like 90210, Melrose Place, Charmed, Medium, Numbers, NCIS, and many more. She's participated in both the CBS Diversity Program and NBC's Writers on the Verge. So she definitely has an interest in helping take writers to that next stage, to that next level. Since starting her consultancy, 156 of her clients have been staffed on shows. 101 pilots have been sold from the writers she's worked with, and 10 of those have gone on to series. So, yeah, I think we have a good guest today. Jen Grisanti, welcome, our newest inductee to the Fantastic Story Society.
Oh, thank you so much. You're fantastic. I so appreciate it. Great to see both of you.
It's good to see you, Jen. It's been so long. I'm sure Scott loves the Hawaii artwork right over your head.
That's what we were talking about before you came on, actually.
Yeah.
We did.
Yeah.
We did. I have so many people who will be in a Zoom session going, what is over your head? I don't know what that is.
They should look at a map. Come on. We should know what Hawaii is.
Exactly.
Well, Jen, thanks for jumping in. We are going to have some comments that we'll get to, everybody, because we're obviously we're hosting this live right now. The recording will be available later. But how excited are you to be inducted into maybe your first secret society? I don't know. Maybe there are
I'm so excited. I mean, first of all, I want to say I love with both of you. I mean, between doing Sundance with you and then Chicago, like I love talking story with you guys because I know that we all share this passion of pulling story apart, understanding story, passing the message on to writers so that they understand what to do with story. So I love that you're doing this new twist with this society, and I'm very honored. Thank you so much for having me.
We have some very weird people who are a part of our society, which I think is, there's something fresh about that. I think we should all kind of embrace our weirdness a little bit when it comes to storytelling. And kind of along those lines, we aren't going to go into the weird supernatural stuff too much with you, Jen. But you do have kind of a finger on the pulse in terms of what's happening in the Hollywood industry right now. And so we'll probably lean toward that a little bit. The first little question, I know Scott has a bunch. I'm just going to throw it out right away, Scott.
Yeah.
Most people, even, non-industry people who just enjoy consuming the material, understand that horror and supernatural is kind of always around. It's always in vogue. It's always something that people gravitate toward. And why is that true compared to like a romantic comedy? Romantic comedies kind of have this ebb and flow, whether it's features or in TV. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there are so many reasons. I think from the viewer point of view, I think horror is all about facing your fears. So we're looking at anxiety we're feeling a threat, and we're seeing an arc of going from a negative place to a positive place in the story. And I feel like there's so much freedom. Like, I have to admit, I even love horror even more than I did before. Like, I think there was something about COVID that made people go into their shells, and the darkness that I feel like is a part of horror is something that we all experienced. And I feel like when I remember watching that film Triangle of Sadness and seeing how powerful that was with the message as well as what it delivered. And I know from when I was a studio executive at CBS, Paramount, and Spelling, I covered Charmed, Medium. I covered a show called All Souls that kind of went into the horror hospital type world. I covered the Kindred. So there is something that I love that I know so many writers love, because with horror, you can go outside the box with the stories you tell, and you can take a deep dive into darkness, which I think we all love the idea of understanding darkness.
Yeah, Scott, because this is one of your favorite genres. I mean, the supernatural, the horror genre, it's one of mine too, of course. Why is it one of your favorites? What do you like the most about it?
There's a lot to what Jen just said there, that you can elevate things in such a crazy way and still have it feel grounded. Like, it's not going fully into fantasy, but you do have to create your own world and your own rules for that world. And then, I don't know, it can be such a metaphorical experience. And I think I talk about this a lot, the first movie that really spoke to me, the first one ever in the horror genre, was Night of the Living Dead. And like, there's no better character piece. You have all of these people, and yes, there's all this stuff going on outside, but it's really about all these people interacting with each other. So it's huge character building.
Yeah. Yeah.
How about for you as well, Max, since I'll throw it back on you.
Yeah, I mean, I like the unknown and the mystery of it all. Like, could this actually happen, and what would I do in this situation? And so it's a lot of what you're talking about, and a lot of what you talk about and teach with your writers is it's this, the writing is a very spiritual journey, and the best forms of writing come from a deeper place in us that we haven't yet found or we're scared to. And I think mystery and supernatural and horror kind of does that in a way where we get to explore things we will probably never experience. I'm never going to be in a zombie apocalypse. I hope anyway. But I like the thought of what would I do in that experience. So there's a very personal connection to the unknown. What would happen if that actually happened to me?
Yeah. So I want to,
in a romantic comedy, I'll just say, I know that I'll probably never find love. So I just don't really equate. I'm kidding.
That's so not true.
We need a grounded, realistic premise here, Max.
Right. Yeah, right.
So first off, I just want to mention, Noelle was asking, is this specifically a horror supernatural conversation. No, it's not. We are just touching on it. We're leaping off into it now. And here's actually a nice segue. Something, Jen, I'm complimenting my own segue. That's good form, right?
Well done, Scott. Well done.
In an email, one of our email exchanges recently, you mentioned that you're all about embracing the dark side of choice in life when it comes to story. So even going away from horror writing or anything like that, but the darker choices. Talk about that in general when it comes to story.
Yes, I think when we look at the shows that are working right now at a very high level, there's a darkness. Like when you look at comedy, there's so much darkness in the idea of understanding darkness. And when you look at things like limiting beliefs and things like recognizing how we all get in our own way of the dream by our negative thoughts. And so when we watch characters who've gone through wounds, who have these negative flaws, behaviors that are getting in the way of the dream, and we see through the pursuit what they do to, whether it's quiet the voices, whether it's gain confidence in belief, like we see characters work through the darkness that we're all going through. And I mean, the world is going through darkness right now. And there are things that are happening that, suddenly everything changes in a moment. People are losing their homes. Certainly when we're looking at the weather and the climate change all over the world, with the wars that are going on, with suddenly people losing everything. And I do think that story is the place that people escape to. And you would think, like, I always remember Aaron Spelling saying, no, when people want to come home, they don't want to see darkness. They don't want to see what their life and their stresses are on TV. They want escape, which I think worked very well for him with producing the types of shows that he was producing. But I think story is evolving as the world is evolving. And because the world has so many unexplained things that are happening in the world that we all have to figure out how to psychologically grasp, I think story is our escape into understanding some of what we can't understand.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there's a tremendous value in looking at the dark side now.
And like Barry is saying, I am sad. Too much darkness in today's reality, not what I want in my entertainment. I totally get that, Barry. I watch at least an episode of Friends every night before I go to bed. It's a total escape. It's just, I'm going to go exist in this completely ridiculous fictional world because it makes me laugh and I feel good when I watch it. And there's absolutely a place for that. Like I think there should be more of a place for it. But at the same time, we're also working in an art medium. We're also trying to present artwork, and so artwork naturally has this sense of what do you think, and people are going to look at it differently, regardless of what the genre is.
It's fascinating.
Well, and it's also, I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to say, it's fascinating having this conversation because, Jen, I know you do have an interest and you've done some studying when it comes to psychology, which, as writers, we're all psychologists to our characters in some way. And, I love the dark stuff as we were talking about, but I'm still wearing my Glendale Community College t-shirt because of the TV show Community. I'm a huge sitcom nut more than horror movies. But still, horror movies or those darker stories can really grab you. And I found it so fascinating. When COVID started, the most viewed movie on Netflix for months was Outbreak. It's like we're surrounded by nothing but virus talk. Right. We're choosing to watch a movie about. So there is that lens of trying to understand our own world by looking at similar things in the creative space.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm seeing some really good questions and comments, everybody. We promised to get to those. We just want to, kind of go into some of the segues here. Noelle has a nice comment here about a genre question. What, in your opinion, Jen, is the difference between horror comedy and black or dark comedy?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, I think when you look at horror, you're kind of looking at an exaggeration of something that that is almost going into a different element, not a sci-fi, but an overly exaggerated darkness. Or I feel like horrors. I mean, I've seen several lately where I'm like, oh my God, they go places where regular shows would never go, as far as what they explore, what they say, which I think is value. Now, dark comedy, when you look at a show like Fleabag, I mean, like, then you're looking at the dark comedy of like the human soul, as far as the darkness of what we embrace in ourselves. And you know, when you look at a show like Fleabag and you're looking at the idea of Fleabag's flaw, which we see in all its glory in the opening of the episode, and then the very powerful and compelling scene when she has to go ask her father for help after her and Boo make the pact that they'll never have to ask anyone for help, and we feel the darkness of the abandonment with the father. That is going into darkness plus the levity of comedy, which I think has tremendous value. And I think when you both talked about, you know, what you do for lightness, like I watch reality shows, I watch Married at First Sight, I watch the Love is Blind or whatever that show is. Like, I do that because I watch, you know, The Voice and American Idol, because I love watching the dream happen. I love believing, and I feel like we all need the balance of what brings us joy, as well as like seeing the trend with Hallmark being so huge because everybody wants love stories. So I think that looking at the balance of all of it, I also feel like another trend that's happening is like, I feel like character driven procedurals where we're seeing darkness are also doing incredibly well, both US shows and very much international shows going into that. And I think there was a show on Netflix called Undercover, which has a character, Fairy, that is very much like Tony Soprano, and they go into the darkness, but there's so much that we get from that. So I think darkness with humor is a winning combination right now.
Yeah. I would think that, and I don't know if this is right or not, I would define horror being violent and dark comedy not necessarily having the physical violence, but still going to a dark place. I don't, I mean, that would be the only way I could think about it. It's interesting that, you know, working in TV as much as you have and currently are, it's just for terminology purposes in the industry. When somebody says an hour long, it's assumed it's a drama, but it doesn't mean it cannot have comedic influence in some way. When we say half hour, it's assumed it's a comedy. Just for anybody who is watching or listening who isn't in the industry, that's just kind of in the back of our heads. I'm trying to get to a point in my head that I don't know if I have a perfect segue. Hour-long comedy doesn't necessarily exist, really, but it's because maybe, and you can say if you agree or not, obviously, because we're able to spend so much more time with these characters and their very personal character stories. And anytime you get deep into a character story, you're going to find what's wrong. There's going to be some kind of darkness in there. In a half-hour comedy, we don't have that much time to spend with them. I don't know. Maybe?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, Shameless, you look at, was like considered an hour-long comedy. So, and that certainly went into the darkness. And I agree with you that I think it's very confusing for some writers who will say, wait, The Bear is a comedy, or something like, you know, where they'll look at and go, but, and I almost feel like a better term is the half-hour drama that still has a level of humor, because I feel like we have so many hybrids going right now, and I feel like it's limiting to get people stuck on, well, it doesn't feel like a comedy, it's a drama, and it is such a funny terminology that the business has, or the way they look at it with the Emmy Awards and the Golden Globe Awards, of they have to have categories,
Mhm.
and the half-hour show falls under comedy. So I think it's something that is evolving, and it'll be interesting to see how the industry evolves with how they look at it.
It's evolved a lot. I mean, I in the early 90s, it wasn't until like Sopranos, 6 Feet Under, some of those early HBO shows that really started to change just that basic format. Or was there an earlier show that I'm forgetting? I don't know. Scott, you were a huge fan of 6 Feet Under.
I mean, I think I saw the first season.
Oh, I thought you were. I remember you saying you were a huge fan.
It was good. But I mean, I was a big Sopranos fan as well. I mean, that's pure drama, though.
Yeah,
None of the laughs are things you feel good about laughing at with that show. But yeah, no, I mean, I think that I'm such a nut for that space too, the dramedy space, because it's more reflective of life. Because you know, as people always say, there's more laughing than crying at a funeral, because you're still like, you know, you're having these emotional connections with people and remembering the good days, and even though it's a sad moment, there's still laughter. Nothing is ever fully sad or fully funny. So I love the dramedy type stuff. But kind of going towards the light again, and Max, like you said, there's a space for all these different things. I think that's the darkness of the pandemic time is what allowed a Ted Lasso to take center stage. And that is such an optimistic and positive show that it's hard to not just love that show.
Yeah.
And I think to me, the modern day one, the current still on the air one, is one, Jen, you just encouraged me to check out, which was Shrinking. And good Lord, I loved that show so much. And of course, that is part of your curriculum, as you're doing some talking around the country, putting these programs on. It makes me wonder, what do you look for when you are trying to collect these are the shows that I'm really going to focus on as a teaching piece?
So I'm always looking for systems of story. Like I'm always looking for, what are the main things that I look for in story? And of course, I would say my brand is known for emotional truth, the idea of the wound and the flaw. And I feel like this year, what I'm going into angle-wise is more looking at things with the wound, the flaw, and the idea of control theory, and the idea of understanding that in every story, the character is questioning, who am I? And so like when I see shows that embody a lot of the concepts that I teach, so that they're great illustrators of the lesson. So say, for example, and I know it's a film, not TV, but yesterday I watched the movie Ferrari. Excellent movie. Like, so I loved the writing. I thought it was so well done. It completely goes into what I teach curriculum wise. So like when I hit stories where I'm like, all right, they're starting with the wound, and then they're going to the flaw, and then we're feeling the negative narrative, and then we're getting the conflicted familial relationship, and they're immediately emotionally engaging us and making us lean in. That's what I'm looking for.
So is there a formula?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. My formula constantly changes. So that's what, like this year, let's look at Ferrari. So when we look at Ferrari, you're starting where he's waking up. We don't know that the woman he's in bed with is not his wife. And we see him have this very sweet moment with the little boy in the next room when he covers him. And then, so we're seeing his flaw, and then we're moving into the recognition that his wife, everyone's looking for him, and his wife is having to cover for him on the phone, and then we're going to get the wound about the trigger event that happens before we enter the story, and that's going to connect to everything. And then we're going to get the conflicted relationship with the mother, we're certainly going to get that there's something different with this relationship, that we see him wake up in the woman's bed. And so by having, oh, and then the opposing parent, when we learn that the mother says the wrong son died. And so, like, when you have these moments in like the first 20 to 30 pages where you're going, all right, everyone knows what it is to lose someone, or maybe they don't, but in this story, like, you're looking at, you know what it is to have regret, to have remorse, to not deal with your grief, which is essentially the flaw of the central character. He is not dealing with his grief. So by having such a spectacular setup that does show us so much conflict in so many different ways, we are emotionally engaging. And then you throw in the plot with what's going on with Ferrari, and that's just enhancing everything all the more. And it's so that, so when I look at, like, I would say formula wise, you know, 3 of the things that I'll be looking at in my new course is the idea of the flaw, the idea of control theory, the idea of who am I, and the idea of the transformation from resistance to freedom as it links to the character arc.
I think that's such a, sorry, Scott, I'm kind of taking this over a little bit with my responses. The resistance, I think it's such a great word. As consultants, I think I've found anyway, one of my biggest hurdles is the terminology, and allowing people to understand what I mean by finding the right word to allow them to then go, oh, I can use that to develop. It's so hard because we hear so many different terms throughout any kind of screenwriting education world. And I think resistance is such a perfect word because there really is that difference. I find features a little bit easier in terms of the formula, because in hour long, you have so many different storylines that are all following technically a formula, but they're all at different places and different page counts. And it's a lot more work in terms of TV writing. But the difference between the first half of the second act and the second half of the second act, there is this level of resistance to start, and then that much more, but then they find their way into that freedom by the end. And you can see it when you really start to watch and pay attention. They're moving through their flaw and using their flaw at the beginning of half of the second act, because that's how they've always been. And then something happens that switches, and now they're starting to fall toward that end of the second act where everything falls apart. And then they have to learn their lesson in the hard way, which then they find freedom. So it's easier for me to see that type of formula because it's a standalone 2-hour movie. Try to explain a little. I mean, it's we don't need to go into a full class or anything, Jen. We only have a certain amount of time. But it's tricky to look at a formula for TV because you've got a half-hour format, you got an hour-long format. The number of characters is different in every series. How prominent or something, it's tricky.
The only difference, and I think so many people complicate it more than it needs to be complicated. So I think when you simplify it, in the difference between television and film when it comes to story is, in film, you're looking at the transformational arc in terms of the flaw, and is the character acknowledging the flaw or denying the flaw when it comes to the resolution. Whereas in television, the flaw is ongoing.
Yeah.
So even though in your all is lost moment, in your first episode, whether it's a limited series, whether it's a network show, in a character-driven show, in your all is lost moment, the character is becoming cognizant of the flaw. But in television, it's much more reflective of life, because in life, we don't heal our flaws. Our flaws are ongoing. We become aware of our flaws, and we may try to take on new traits as a way to process and move through our flaws, but they are a continuous ongoing thing. So in television, you're just looking at the idea that the flaw is ongoing. So certainly, Scott, like you mentioned, shrinking, you know, we see his flaw in all its glory in the opening, and we get a sense of what is making him resist moving forward with life, which is linked to the trigger event that happens before we enter the story. And we have the dynamic with the daughter to reflect his forward movement that is going to allow him to move beyond the resistance. And then we see through the plot with what he does as a cognitive behavioral therapist. And certainly you add the twist, which is great for the concept, is you have a therapist who's traumatized, who's suddenly going to tell his patients how he really feels, which is a great hook into a show.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because I think, well, I guess, how is, whether it's the structure or just the storytelling style, how has it been changing lately? Like, is there, if somebody had a screenplay, a pilot idea from years ago that they haven't sold, but it's still really good, would it feel dated in a certain way because the formula has changed a little bit?
I believe so. I feel like story is always evolving. Like, that's why, Max, when you ask me what's my formula is always changing, because I'm always gaining insight from watching the brilliant writing that's being done in streaming and in film. And I think, like, I feel like it used to be, when people globbed onto the idea of the wound and the value of the wound, we saw so many shows starting with the wound, which is great because it brings us into the heat of the moment. And then it was almost like, I feel like the big trend right now that is great is so many shows are choosing to start with the flaw. And we're seeing the flaw in all its glory in the opening, which, when you look at the flaw is the story of the wound. So without having to go to a flashback or show something in real time, you have the gift of the flaw. And then shows are using things like the background, like you'll see a picture in the background where a character is missing. Like in Shrinking, when that picture is turned over and the daughter turns the picture up, and suddenly we get what the void is. We understand what's causing the resistance, and there's a mystery, and the audience has to figure that out. So yes, I think if somebody wrote a script 5 years ago, the chances are that it's going to feel dated, because now story is going deeper than it ever has before, which is a gift to all of us who are watching it.
And Lisa is saying the trend is moving this way because you taught those writers to go that route, which might be true. I think what's important for everybody, especially in the screenwriting, section of the audience, people who are writers, to really hear, not that you have to read between the lines too much. We haven't talked about plot really at all. Like the plot for me, I always kind of equate it to when I watch a trailer. I'll tune in because it's like, hey, cool, there's a map on the back of the Declaration of Independence. That's kind of neat. But I'm going to actually enjoy the story because the characters are engaging. I'm not saying National Treasure was this incredibly engaging character adventure or anything, but I'll enjoy it because the characters are the ones who are embroiled within the plot. So I think for anyone who's trying to begin the process of conceptualizing an episode of TV or a series, start with character. Who is this person? Who are the multiple people that need to learn something? Why do they need to? And then what plot situation am I going to put them in? Sometimes it happens the reverse. You have this great idea, but then it stays there. And then you need to be jumping into the characters.
Yeah. So I have a very practical question for you. How do you determine, or how do you describe that balance between a good hook, get somebody to understand what's going on and what makes it unique, versus keeping the mystery of the slow reveal going? As you were talking about with Shrinking, that like, oh, there's a very complicated backstory to why this therapist is all messed up. You don't want to give away too much too fast, but at the same time, you do want to make sure that people are on board. How do you guide people through that?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think the puzzle, you're right, Max. Like, I feel like it is always hard to know how, like, I feel like writers face the challenge of people saying you give too much character and not enough plot, or too much plot and not enough character in your pilot. So I think you have to, I think it helps writers when you think about, what is my season one question? What is my question driving season one? How is the pilot arc the first step toward that answer? And then asking yourselves questions like, is the mystery of the wound a part of the engine of story, or is it not? Because if the wound is more to just emotionally bring us in, but it's not really the transformation of what the character is going through in the story, then you can just touch on the wound, and the trigger event that happens before we enter the story might have more of the engine to it. So then you're following that arc. But I think oh God, there's such a great book, AFI by Donna Cooper. I think writing a great screenplay in TV and film, something like that. And it's Donna with one N. I remember what she goes into that's so brilliant is she goes into the idea of the puzzle, and how do you break apart the arc, and understanding how does that puzzle parallel the plot and what you want to say with the plot. So I think that you have to ask yourself so many questions when you start with your concept, in terms of what is the engine of the series. Is it the past wound and the mystery behind the past wound? Is it the mystery having to do with the trigger event before we entered the story, and how you're unraveling the puzzle pieces to that? Or is it, there are some shows where the transformation is really about what happens in the series arc setup, and how the end of the season one is going to be the answer to that. But that all comes down to strategy and knowing where you're going, and knowing what services your story in the best way possible.
And you could also kind of look at a season of TV as a movie in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Start kind of planning. The middle episode is going to be the big twist and the huge reveal. The second to last episode will probably be the whatever you call it, the low point or all is lost kind of thing. I noticed that in Game of Thrones. The second to last, maybe third to last episode of every single season was always the best episode, because the bad guys won.
It was The Sopranos.
Yeah, we spent the whole time prior to that episode in the season really falling in love with these people. And so it was all just character stuff with, cool plot things happening, of course, because it's Game of Thrones and fantasy. But then that second to last episode, we got a freaking zombie dragon. We're screwed. It's the same
and
thing.
if it's written well, like Succession and Billions was the same thing. That you knew when you got to the end of the season that there was gonna be a great impact with how they end the season. But that's when a show is done well. Like recently I watched a show where the first season was excellent and the second season was good, but they failed in the last episode because it was too broad and didn't link back and answer the question coming out of the first episode. And then the show didn't get picked up. It all comes down to strategy and knowing where you're going with your story.
Which is so much easier said than done, Jen. It's so much easier said than done.
It is. You're right. Yeah.
I'll tell you this. So I could listen to Jen talk about story for at least 6 weeks at a time.
There you go.
We so let everybody know what we're gonna do. Jen has a free webinar coming up, and some other offerings that we're gonna talk about. We will talk about that right now, and then we will get to I think a probably pretty fun behind the scenes type story or two about writing, I don't know, within the networks system with writers, and then we will also get to all of the questions that you guys have been asking. So please keep even though we haven't responded to them live, we have been starring them. We'll come back to them.
Yeah.
So feel free to keep asking them. But Jen, what is on the immediate horizon for you?
So I have a free webinar on February 20th, and it is at noon Pacific Standard Time. And I'm so excited because it is going to be all about looking at my new angle for story and what I'm seeing in current shows that is hitting at a high level, and how I can teach this to writers so that they can write scripts that can lead them to a sale. So that is always my mission. So the webinar is free. The webinar will lead into what I'll announce about my 6-week teleseminar, which both are called Story Therapy from Resistance to Freedom. And it's all about going into the character arc and understanding, how do you write a character arc that could carry several seasons and keep the audience emotionally engaged?
I love it.
I mean, just the word freedom being in there, like resistance. I get that. Freedom. What's that like?
Yeah, right. What does that mean? Yeah, you should be hosting some spiritual retreats too, Jen, and with that same idea, resistance to freedom, you know?
Do you know, it's so interesting, Max? There's something that I heard in my meditation this morning, and I'm like, oh my God, that is story. Like, that's everything story is. So when it comes to spiritual mindset, how it applies to story, when you look at meditation is all about shutting down what we talked about with the negative voices inside and limiting beliefs, and meditation, you're dropping all of those, which is the same thing of what you're looking for in the transformational arc and story. Is you're looking for a character who the voices are so loud when it comes to the dream, and how can you create a plot that allows the voices to quiet? So that's going into the spiritual side.
I love that, because then you're also trying as the writer to brainstorm moments that are going to force that character to face up to having to drop those beliefs or thoughts or flaws, etc. I like looking at story really in any sense, even if you're telling a little 6-minute story around a bonfire, starting with characters so that they understand the type that's moving through that story. Like if you really just break it down foundational, but then for a longer form story, thinking of it's actually the flaw that's moving through the story. It's not the character, because someone asked, is how much character development is too much character development. I think Noelle was saying something like, I have like a CIA background of investigation on these characters. It's a good question. Like, I don't know if there is such a thing as too much, but it can bring you to a place where you actually forget why you're putting this character through this experience.
It definitely is. I like the question, the idea of how much is too much character development. Always know that we should know the most about the central character driving the series. So I think a mistake that many writers make is they give us more information about supporting characters or character than they do about the main protagonist. So I think like creating a strategy, if you're thinking of a season-long arc for your main protagonist, then knowing how much you want to give in the pilot, because again, I think a note that a lot of studios give, so many writers will say, oh, well, I was going to do that in episode 2, or I was going to do that in episode 3. And the response will be, well, you're not going to sell your pilot unless we know that in the pilot. So understanding, like, how do you pack enough in the pilot that makes us lean in and die to find out what is going to happen in the series?
Yeah. It reminds me of a Seinfeld moment when George and Jerry were trying to pitch their show to an executive at NBC, and George is like, it's a show about nothing. And the executive says, why am I watching this? And George says, because it's on TV. And the executive says, not yet.
I love that.
Not yet. You got to put it in the pilot, man.
That is great. That's great.
And I just wanted to mention the 6-week course, Story Therapy from Resistance to Freedom, starting March 5th. I just want to run down what shows you're going to be talking about, because this might be of interest to people.
Great.
The Diplomat, Beef, Wednesday, Bad Sisters, Daisy Jones and the Six, Tiny Beautiful Things, Shrinking, as we talked a lot about here, Slow Horses, and Anatomy of a Fall, right? As the movie, or
No, actually, the movie is going to be Past Lives.
it is going to be Past Lives. Okay.
Yeah, I am still utilizing Anatomy of a Fall as part of the webinar, so people will have to come and see how I'm utilizing that.
I see. And if anybody out there has not seen Past Lives, it is a beautiful film. The ISA, we got to watch the world premiere at Sundance last year, and that's the one we walked away talking about. We watched a whole bunch of movies, but Past Lives was the one that grabbed us.
It stays with you.
Yeah.
Like you feel the story so much. That's why I chose,
certainly a character piece. I mean, it's really, it's all about just the quiet moments, but it's about falling in love with these characters and understanding what they're going through. But I mean, it's quite a range there from something like that to Wednesday or to Be, you know, and it's, it's the great thing about story is that they all have to follow these same principles to work. You know,
well, and like you look at a show like Wednesday versus a show like Past Lives, and you think about the simplicity of being on the outside looking in.
Right.
And it's like you look at the groundedness and you look at the fear of regret, you know, and those are all very universal things for all of us of that, you know, what if that choice, what if I didn't make the right choice? I mean, that's a great thing to explore. And then I think with Wednesday, when you're looking at the idea of an outsider who goes to a school for outsiders and still feels on the outside, that, you know, that is emotionally bringing us in.
Yeah.
All right. So should we hear this background behind the scenes story that Jen has? We usually ask people for a ghost story. We're not going to put you on the spot, Jen. Have you ever had a weird ghostly experience?
And then you just immediately put it on the spot.
You now. You could say no.
You know, it is funny. I don't think I have never, like I always listened to ghost stories growing up. So I always loved like when you would have a sleepover and you get in a circle and you do talk about a seance and do a scary story. Like I love that, which I think goes into what we talked about with horror and how we all get like you know, the momentum and the idea of it, and I love that. I wish I could have an actual ghost story, but unfortunately I don't.
Right. I think for everybody in the audience, I think they would rather hear some form of an industry story other than mugs. Apparently she's saying ghost stories finally.
I love that, and we'll have to maybe have a class where it's like we're sharing what the ghost stories are. But as far as an industry story, I mean, I think you asked about pitching or staffing, and I started thinking about that, and I thought, you know, as far as writers really grasping what they can learn from. So I thought of a quick staffing story, which I know I've told before, but the idea that I had a writer who wrote a spec script that kind of hit it out of the ballpark. It was The Sopranos. And it was such an emotional story arc having to do with Tony feeling humiliation at the beginning when he was a boy, and then connecting that to the violence that was happening in the plot in the present. And it was something thematically that the writer I still remember everything about it. And I'm not going into the nitty gritty of the details, but it's something that I still know that, and it's because it sat with me. Well, anyway, this writer I brought into the writer's room, and he was prepared. Like he met the executive producer. He knew that people had responded to his script in a very, very strong way. He knew that he wrote from an emotional truth that he shared in the meeting, and he did a smart thing. He asked the showrunner questions about the show. He commented on what he loved. And it was a mixture of all of this. And it was the only time I ever had it happen in my 15-year or 12 and a half year studio executive career where I saw a writer get staffed in the room. And that was, so this writer, so he wrote the right spec, he was prepared for the meeting, he went in there, he asked questions, he had comments of what he loved about the show, and the showrunner loved him so much he staffed him in the room. So I think that there's so much to learn from that, versus I've had writers when I was a current executive who were brought into the room who immediately gave their opinion of what they didn't think worked about the show.
Oops.
And knowing, you know, what the balance is of that. So I think that story-wise for me just makes me see. And then I think with pitching, when I think of the best pitch that I've ever seen, there are so many that come to mind, because certainly with my Storywise teleseminar, to see the arc of growth that happens during that, as well as the professional pitches I saw as a studio executive and in Writers on the Verge. I would say it's more about looking at what are the qualities of those pitches that are standing out. And the qualities that I can think that can help writers are confidence, number one, confidence and passion. Number two, starting with a question is what I notice in the pitches, all that stand out, starting with a question, and then in the closing, answering that question. Being very confident with how you tell stories. So grabbing a moment from your story, and then also always remembering to have your log line at the beginning so that your audience knows where you're going with your story. So these were the things that were qualities that were a part of all the pitches that I thought stood out, and I still remember.
I think it's really interesting, the idea of the question, because there still needs to be some kind of, maybe I'm just speaking personally, an intriguing, like, emotional element to the question, because asking just a plot-based question, people will be like, I don't know.
Oh no, the emotional based question, and it's going off of the inspiration. So when you're starting with the inspiration with an emotional truth, and then you're asking a question that's stemming from that, it's not, I should have defined that. It's definitely a story based question versus a plot based question.
Yeah. But then at the end of a log line, I hate it when question marks are at the end of a log line, because immediately I'm like, I don't know. Yeah,
you shouldn't have a question line at the end of a log line. No, that the log line is different. So you're starting with your inspiration, what your emotional truth is. You're making sure that's short. Then you're leading into an emotional question that goes into the story of the character. And then you're going into the log line. That is allowing your audience to understand where you're going with your story. Because I think the place, I know when I was at the studio, and the place where writers would start to ramble and lose their audience is when they would go into the characters and we didn't know what the plot was. So the log line, so that's why you're starting with the emotion, your emotional truth, going into an emotional question. Then you're giving us a sense of the plot through your series log line, and then you're bringing us into the character.
Love it. There you go, everybody.
Yeah, I mean, this is really, really insightful, valuable information here. And also, you know, the ISA, we do an annual, or a couple times a year, a pitch challenge event where, you know, people can for free submit their pitches, and then a handful of people get to pitch to a live panel. And one of our executive panelists last time talked about that as well. Like, well, let's look at that again, but here's a question you could ask. And it's about getting the engagement right away, getting the people hearing your pitch to be engaged, to be a participant. And so I would say, I mean, Brad was asking for an example, which is kind of hard to come out of the blue and come up with an example. But
I'll give it a little quick example, unless you want to keep going.
Well, I was just going to say the pitch challenge is still live and free for everybody. So go to the Network ISA YouTube channel and our pro tips page. You can find it there, and you can hear some of that. But go ahead, Max.
I have a YA animated series that we've pitched to a whole bunch of different places. Terribly nerve-wracking. But you get better at it the more you do it, But I was starting with more of a plot-based question. And it was an interesting question because it's fantasy, but it isn't really all that character-driven. Unless I ended up going back and giving a little bit more of my own personal connection to the story, which is difficult because this is a series about a 6-inch tall fairy with shredded wings, which you would not think that I have much connection to a 6-inch, female fairy. But the plot question was, what happens after you make a wish? Which is an interesting question, but it isn't enough for like an executive to go, gosh, I don't know. They're not going to be sitting up in their chair. And it took me a while to realize, that's not as engaging. It's an interesting question. It's not as engaging as it could be because there's no real character connected to it.
Yeah.
So that's, I'm not going to go into the entire pitch, but
it still asks a question, like when you look at what I mentioned about Ferrari, and that does make us lean in, Max, like you still wish, I've heard people say something like, have you ever had a dream where you fell off a building and woken up and were so happy that didn't happen? So you start with that, and that emotionally still brings us in, even though it's not like this, emotional character thing, but it still brings us in.
Mm-hmm.
Or you look at like the film for Ferrari, when you know that part of the transformational arc has to do with the protagonist who refuses to grieve. Then, have you ever lost someone that you were just not ready to lose? And so rather than deal with the pain, you just distract yourself. Something like that.
Right. You go a little bit further. Yeah, because like my extension of it was, what happens after you make a wish that you're the only one you can grant that wish? I didn't say that correctly.
Yeah.
But there was a connection to someone that's actually making the wish, which is, anyway.
I was thinking about the bear and thinking like, well, okay, how could I start it? I was thinking something along the lines of, have you ever been at the end of your rope and then suddenly you had to clean up a family member's mess? Would that do it, you think? Because,
Yep. That emotionally brings us in.
Sure.
Yeah, that was great.
And then you have to take over a dying sandwich shop and you're, you get a little into the actual specific situation.
Exactly. And then you reveal that, and that family member has passed away, so that can't even help out anymore.
Yeah.
All of that. All right, so let's dive into some of the questions. Max, do you see one you want to start with?
Let's start. I'm going to just go randomly here. Bennett, I have enough content to write 8 one-hour episodes. Should I concentrate on just writing a great pilot, or is it okay that I'm writing a full season before sending this out?
Do you know, if in a limited series, I have seen people do that. I'm going to tell you the rule of thumb is no, write the first episode, write the heck out of it, put everything into it, have a Bible that gives us a strong glimpse of the other episodes. That's a better way to go. But I have known writers who have sold limited series who wrote all 6 episodes. So I'm not going to say never, but it's not a common practice.
Yeah.
I guess just make sure, I suppose, that the put all the effort possible into that first one before going into the next.
But also using the pitch deck as a way to further sell the series, because they are going to want to see what is going to happen. What do you think is going to happen? Because unless you have a bunch of credits behind you, you may not even be staffed on the show. There's a likelihood that you will be, but then again, it's so situational and circumstantial in terms of what the show is. You may just sell the show outright. Jen, you would probably have a lot more insight on that. If you sell a show, are you guaranteed to be staffed on the show that you sold?
Yes. Certainly
Okay.
when you get your contracts in. Now, I've seen, I remember, I always got this question, can a new writer sell a show? In my experience as a studio executive, I only saw 2 shows sold by brand new writers where they were staffed, but obviously a showrunner was brought on. And in both circumstances, the writer got let go after the first year.
Mm-hmm.
But if the contract says, I remember one of them got 6 seasons worth of payments of the show because the writer created the show. So yeah.
You're definitely not going to run your own show.
No, no.
I mean, unless you're already having that experience.
Yeah, I am, again, I think when I look at my career, I remember one writer that it was fascinating to me who was in the film world and had success in the film world. And when he created the pilot, even though he had zero success in the TV world, they did allow him to run the show. So it was real. And he didn't have huge success in the film world. It was very moderate.
Interesting.
But they allowed it to transfer. Yeah.
Interesting. Scott, you want to pick the next one?
Yeah, I think since we're talking about limited series already, Muggs is asking, is there a sweet spot specifically for a mystery or thriller? Do you think audiences are more prone to stay engaged for 6 episodes or a 12-episode season?
I think that's an excellent question, Muggs. Hello. I think it, again, depends on the story in terms of the engine. So I personally, I don't like when a limited series, even though I have seen excellent ones, are only 4 episodes. I get frustrated as a viewer.
Yeah.
I want like a minimum of 6 to 8 episodes. And if I love the concept and it's over in 8 episodes, then I also find myself frustrated and wish that it was 10 episodes. But that's probably what you want. You want the audience to want more. Right. So I would say, like, in my experience, from just viewing, I would say understanding your concept, understanding whether you feel like we've all seen limited series where we're like, oh my God, they could have done that less, because it just went on and just did not advance in a way.
How is the market for limited series?
I was just going to ask that, yeah.
Because I've heard it's one of the tougher things to sell, especially if it's not based on pre-existing IP.
Very hard to sell if it's not existing on pre-existing IP. I think the first intention for the limited series was, we could get massive stars for a limited amount of time. And then I think when you look at like David E. Kelly's, I'm blanking on the name of it, with Nicole Kidman, when that series, then they decided they wanted to go to a second season because the actors loved the concept and were willing to come back. So there still is a lot of marketability for the limited series, without a doubt, because again, you can get actors. And so I see it happening still at a high level.
Okay. Yeah. The limited series are tricky. I mean, Mike Flanagan has kind of just nailed it in terms of
Mike White.
And Mike White.
Yeah.
What I loved about Mike Flanagan's series, Haunting of Hill House and Haunting of Bly Manor and all these things, I felt very satisfied by the end of the limited. I didn't feel like I had too much, and I didn't feel like I wanted more. I was like, this is the end of the story. I'm good with it.
I agree.
I don't know how he's doing it every time, man. It's really impressive.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it's hard. I mean, you look at True Detective, and it's like, you can have a good season and then you can have an unbelievable season, and then you can have one that doesn't hit in the same way. It's not an easy thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Mike S. has real life ghost stories. I've been considering writing a show about a true life. Do it, Mike. Maybe you'll be the next guest on the Fantastic.
Yes.
Mike, share a ghost story.
Yeah, right. Noelle, is it possible for my protagonist to be the villain? My horror series is about 5 women taking back their power back from those who caused them pain.
I love that question. I think it depends. I mean, I think it depends on how you write the character. I have seen the protagonist become the antagonist. Obviously, I mean, we all have seen elements in that when you look at Breaking Bad with the idea of evil. But I think that it all comes down to how you write it. I feel like that is outside the box, which I feel like outside the box is a good thing to do right now, really good thing to do. And I feel like so many writers are breaking the rules and going outside. So I do think if you can pull it off, that would be something interesting, as long as we feel some type of connection to that character.
Which
That
the
will
irony
help.
then is that it is then the protagonist. Like, it's no longer the villain. I try to use multiple terms to describe those characters just because it helps my brain. But like, if you're saying my villain is going to be the protagonist, now it's not, that person isn't necessarily the villain anymore. He's the main character, or she is. And now we're following that person's story. And then there is going to be some kind of opposing force, which you could then call in that character's life the villain, or how, it's all terminology stuff. But I like the idea of basically kind of what you're saying, Jen, is what about making really a lot more unlikable characters, or characters who are doing terrible things that we are kind of forced as an audience to follow, and actually, in a weird way, have empathy for this person that we know is terrible. Breaking Bad really was a great example of that.
Yeah. So we have some state of the industry. I'm going to combine two of them here. About, is there a market for teenage drama series in the vein of OC, 90210, Gossip Girl, Riverdale, etc.? And then Candace was asking about more musical series like another Daisy Jones and the Six. I don't know how much you are communicating with executives and what they're looking for, what their mandates are, but do either of these genres jump out to you?
Well, Daisy Jones and the Six, which is obviously part of my curriculum on my new course, I love that. Like, for me, I felt that show so much. I was so sad when that show was over. Like, I just felt so connected to that show. So do I think when you have a success like that, where it's getting recognized by award shows like it did with getting nominated, does that open the door? Yes, that absolutely opens the door. As far as the question about like the OC, I like, when I look at the half-hour teen, certainly when you're looking at, Stranger Things and Wednesday, yes, you can't, it used to be that you could not have a lead drive a series that was that young, but that's changed. That has changed with the success of shows. But when I look at Beverly Hills 90210, Riverdale, Gossip Girl, One Tree Hill, I feel like that genre has evolved. So I think having that genre reflective of shows that are connecting the audience on a deeper level to the characters within that world, like Sex Academy, or what was
Sex Education.
Sex Education.
Yeah.
Like, when you look at Sex Education, that kind of evolved the 90210 into something more. So I think that is a good way to go. But then when you look at the success of the rom-com idea and Hallmark hitting like they are, I mean, there might be a time where certainly CW used to be well known for that,
Kind of the soapy approach to drama. Yeah. I think it also speaks a little bit to how the younger generation is more mature in some ways. I don't know if that's necessarily true across the board, of course, but
I think that is true.
There's this, maturity from them, and they have higher expectations in terms of how they're represented. I think it's important to pay attention to that. Kind of along somewhat of the same lines, Eric is asking at the bottom, Scott, is episodic versus serialized dead? Is episodic dead? I don't think it's completely dead. No. Yeah.
No, I don't think episodic will ever be completely dead. I think, like, when I look at, say, Luther versus CSI or Law and Order, I think there's more value in a Luther where you have a close-ended, but you also have an ongoing character arc and series arc. So I think, not unlike oh God, there was another show that I'm blanking on. So Dexter. So Dexter was the same thing. So I think like when you're looking at Law and Order CSI, there's a value. I mean, there are so many people who just want to watch an episode and not have to know what the series arc, what's driving the series arc, that they can just jump in. So those are still,
well, I mean, look at all the
doing well.
The BritBox dramas. So many of those British dramas are very episodic with light serialized approaches where we get to know the character. So it's kind of a blend in a way, but where you're leaning toward one more than the other. How many questions do you think we have left here, Scott?
Well, I see about 7 of them there, but I don't think we'll probably have time. We want to be respectful of Jen's time.
Yeah.
I do want to take this one from Aaron because I love that he's already doing the research. He's checking out Jen's website. Here's a question from your site, and he just wants you to elaborate on something you said on your site. And then Max, maybe you can take one more after that, and we can call it.
Sure.
Let's see. A writer tip from your website: a strong way to reveal backstory is through symbolism. Create an arc for the story about a symbol. Create anticipation leading to a reveal. Can you elaborate? So let me see if I can remember this episode. So there was an episode of Mad Men that I think led me to that story tip. There was an episode of Mad Men where the idea was Don Draper was having an affair with the teacher, and the teacher was in bed with him and said, "Oh, I have a student in school who says," I think his name was Bobby, even if I remember right, who says, "How do I know you see blue like I see blue?" And that started a theme throughout the episode with how we see things. And it was threaded throughout the episode thematically in a way that used the symbolism and expanded on it into different ways of light and dark and how they use that in the episode. So that was what inspired that story tip.
So symbolism doesn't necessarily have to be a quite literal physical symbol. It's metaphor. It's unconscious meaning. What does something symbolize? I think that's a really great example.
Yeah.
I'm going to choose the last one. And just because Tony is a story farm writer, I'm going to go with Tony's question. Is making a short film a way to get hired as a TV writer, or does it only help for features? What are the purposes of making a short film, other than the experience of production, of course?
So I was a judge at the Big Island Film Festival for 5 years, and I asked myself that same question. Like, I really thought, okay, so what is the purpose of this? And what I gained from my experience is there's tremendous value in writing a short, in that if your intention in writing the short is to sell a feature length, there's value with that, and seeing how it does in the film festivals, and then going to film festivals and being a part of it. Now, as far as the executive viewpoint, like when I was looking at these festivals, I did feel like there was a value in seeing a point of view in a short amount of time. Like, I remember Damon Lindelof, a huge writer in the business, created or was the executive producer on Lost, and with J.J. Abrams. Like, Damon Lindelof, I remember when he wrote a short. So it wasn't, I don't know if it got made or not, or it was in festivals, but he wrote a short, and there was a tremendous value from a studio executive point of view because it was 22 pages. So when you have 300 scripts behind you during staffing season, and you have somebody who has a 22-page script with a strong point of view, and that script opened so many doors for him. I think maybe if you Google it, it might be online somewhere. It had a sci-fi element to it, had a universal grounded element to it that I still remember. And that opened doors for him. So there was a value.
Okay. There you go. So the writing of the script from a writing standpoint is more valuable. The short film is a little bit more of a director's medium. Look at what I can do. And the writer sadly isn't as, Well, it's usually because the writer is the director, but not all the time. Thank you, everybody. I apologize to everybody that we can't get to all of your questions. I love how many questions there were. There were so many comments, and I think it speaks to Jen's popularity. You've really made something for yourself here, Jen. In terms, everybody loves you. Everybody I talk to, like, oh yeah, you should totally do Jen Grisanti's classes, and it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
No,
well, I have loved every energy experience that I have with you guys. I love what you are doing for screenwriters. I love how much I hear. I cannot tell you how many writers I work with who are like, oh my God, I love ISA. Oh my God, I learned so much there. Oh my gosh. So, it goes hand in hand. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, Scott, do we make it official?
Well, she's officially on the team, that's for sure. I just wanted to quickly say again that Jen's free webinar, which is February 20th, noon Pacific time, is coming up. I put the link in the comments just recently. I'll put it in the video description as well, in case that's not clickable. But then, of course, after that is the 6-week story therapy course starting March 5th, from resistance to freedom. Going into so many elements of, telling the stories, but using the examples of these current shows that aren't just fun, but they're award-winning and they're doing it right. So it's going to be really a lot of fun to go through that. So I hope everybody that is writing something, or even just in the development stage of writing for television, takes the time and at the very least takes that free webinar in about 15 days.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jen, and for all of you who still here watching and listening. Scott and I host a podcast called The Fantastic Story Society. So we were kind of doing this in league with the ISA this time, even though Scott and I both work for the ISA. It's our own separate little thing. That's our ghosty logo up in the upper right corner of the screen. And we usually talk about really weird things, but bring in people who are experts within that weird thing. And I think a lot of people could probably say screenwriting is a pretty weird thing. So Jen was a perfect guest for this. We always round out the episode by saying, pay attention to the world around you because there are stories everywhere. And if you hear of any, you can reach out and let us know, and you might be the next inductee to the Fantastic Story Society.